Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Juma Iraqi, and today I have brought back with me Lyle McDonald, so we're going to speak a bit about fat loss today. And before we start, I just want to inform that this podcast will be available on YouTube in video format, but you can also listen to it on iTunes as well. So Lyle, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast. We did previous podcast on fat loss specifically for females, but
Yes.
for people that haven't listened to that podcast, could you please give us a short introduction about yourself?
So my name is Lyle McDonald. Imagine most people listening have at least heard my name. I've been in the industry since 1995 when the internet first started. I went to UCLA to study exercise physiology back in the day, and have always been very interested in nutrition, fat loss, dieting, metabolic rate adaptation, in terms also performance muscle gain. It's always been very fascinating to me. I think I tend to be known very much for fat loss, just because a majority of my books have been written about that. As Jumai mentioned, I'm currently sort of entrenched in a book on women's issues, since women do have some specific issues that men simply don't deal with. But that was the topic of that entirely other podcast. So today I'm going to sort of treat it, as fairly gender independent, but do note that clearly there are some pretty major differences between men and women in this regard.
Yeah, excellent. And just before we start with the questions, the podcast we actually did is the most viewed podcast, so it's clearly a topic that a lot of people are interested in. So if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend that you watch or listen to the podcast I did earlier with Lyle McDonald on that topic. So the first question, just to get things started, is what genetic and environmental factors can contribute to making fat loss more difficult for some people compared to others?
Okay, so let me be sort of honest up front. The genetic stuff has been changing so rapidly. There's so many new developments, and I'll be honest, I've been so truly entrenched is the right word in the women's book. I'm very much behind on this. So some of these things I can't actually claim to be, as up to date on the literature as I'd like to be. Also, as interesting as the genetic stuff is, I tend to lump it into things we can't control. But just some of the random factors they've found. A lot of it has focused on fat cell metabolism, things that have to do with receptors like PPARs, which are peroxisome proliferation activated receptors, and there's an alpha, beta, and a gamma, and differences in the function of those can affect things like how readily or how unreadily the fat cell releases fatty acids for burning. They've identified a number of different genes. Some listeners may be familiar with what was called FTO, which I forget what it stands for offhand. That seemed to explain it was a small amount. It was like 4% of the difference in body weight. It was actually a very small contributor. A lot of the genetic differences they found are these very extreme, what are called monogenetic differences. So we'll talk about leptin later. Some people don't produce leptin. There's about 12 of them in the world. They found it within this one very narrow family. Extremely rare. There's something called the MC4, the melanocortin 4 receptor. This is in the brain. It affects, melanocortins are just one of the endless systems that regulate this. A gene mutation there can explain something like 4% of the cases of truly morbid obesity. There are differences in things like skeletal muscle function, how readily or unreadily it uses fatty acids versus glucose for fuel. I think the main ones we're focusing on are probably the ones related to things like energy expenditure. All that other stuff tends to be sort of going on in a way under the hood. It's like, yes, releasing fatty acids from fat cells is important. I don't know how relevant that really is in the beginning stages. A lot of these other mutations in the brain tend to be when they occur, they're enormously, like they have profound effects, but they're very rare, right? Typically, if you see someone that has one of those, that's the kid who's 300 pounds by the time he's 8 years old. Like when you're born with one of these severe genetic mutations, they are just staggering. There's another one, there's a disease called Prader-Willi, which has to do with ghrelin, which we'll also talk about. People with this disease don't get the fullness signal from eating. They are ravenously hungry all the time. But I'm not talking about diet hungry. I'm not talking about I'm hungry. I'm talking about they have to lock the food up in their houses because they will not physically stop eating. These are at the extremes. Now, it's possible that there are lighter versions of this in the same way that disease can range from super extreme to in the middle. I read a paper one time that I cannot find suggesting that most of the mutations they'd found had to do more with appetite than activity or with energy expenditure, which was kind of interesting. There are clearly, however, there's individual variation in things like energy expenditure. And just for background, because we'll talk, this will come up again later, there are 4 components to how many calories you burn in a day. Resting metabolic rate. This is just how many calories you burn at rest. Laying in bed, sitting on the couch represents the processes to keep your heart beating. Light muscle contractions, organ, brain. They actually haven't found many differences there. Variation between people and resting metabolic rate, not enormous. 5, maybe 10% either direction. This idea of a low metabolic rate really doesn't exist outside of severe, like hypothyroid, severe conditions. There's the thermic effect of food, how many calories you burn when you eat. Not a lot of variation there, at least not from a genetic standpoint. And also, it's very small. It's about 10% of your total calorie intake. So if you eat 2,500 calories, it's 250. You're just not, you don't cut that in half, it's only 100 calories a day. Like there's not big variations there. There's the thermic effect of activity, formal exercise. And it is interesting, they are finding genetic differences in people's propensity or enjoyment of exercise. And I think this is something that's frequently not really taken into account. Some people just hate it. Some people love activity. Some animals that have these genetic differences, they just move around all the time. They love wheel running. They move around tons. They burn a ton of calories. Others do not. And they're starting to identify neurochemical changes there. And very tangentially, I think a problem there. People in this industry who are coaches and fitness people, invariably we come from the background of the folks that love this stuff. We love exercise. We wouldn't do it. We are frequently coaching people that don't. And it's very hard to freely wrap our, why would someone not love, I love this. People, so there's probably genetic component there. Although unlikely to be many differences in how many calories someone burns. It's just a matter of someone wanting to do it. The big one really is called NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, right? Originally it was thought to be that fidgeting, unconscious activity. And that's hugely genetic. Right? We've all known that one guy who's just, well, you can't see my, but like bouncing their leg and they won't stand still. That burns a lot of calories. And some people have very low levels of NEAT, and that seems to be very genetic. They're now including non-exercise movements. So if you park far away from the grocery store and walk, that's NEAT. Things like standing desks, walking desks, these things are being, so those are the 4 components. Resting metabolic rate, not huge genetic changes. Thermic effect of food, almost none. Thermic effect of exercise or activity, the genetic differences would mainly be in who sort of spontaneously does or does not engage in it. And then NEAT, huge genetic differences. In either who does it spontaneously, they've shown differences in how much NEAT changes with overfeeding. Right? There's a classic study from way back when. Overfed a group of people by 1,000 calories. Some of them increased NEAT by like 700 calories a day. So they only stored 300, very little fat gain. One woman actually decreased her NEAT. She stored the most fat. Yeah. Huge. And right now the focus really is on this NEAT component because it's the one with the most variability. They've actually shown that between any 2 people, NEAT can vary by 2,000 calories a day. Wow. I mean, that's staggering, right? Yeah. That is 3 hours of moderate to hard exercise a day. And this is through completely non-exercise related activities. Very small changes there have enormous impacts. And there is that big genetic, right? Some of it is environmental. In the Western world, there's a direct relationship between how westernized, how modernized the world is, and how much NEAT people get, right? I live in America. We are a driving culture. You don't walk anywhere. You don't. You drive. I live in Texas. It's even worse here. You go to New York, people walk everywhere. I can't really speak to other countries, but I know, cycling is a much larger component in a lot of European countries. It's part of the culture, and the cities are set up for it. They've shown that different countries, vastly different levels of NEAT, and there are gender differences. In one, women have the highest levels. I forget where it is. However, they also are the ones that work in the fields, and they also do all the housework. The men basically sit around being lazy. So the women have like 900 cal. In the UK, US, and most it's about equal between men and women, but it's much, much lower because unless you labor, unless you work in the fields, what do you have to do all day? Sit in front of the computer and do podcasts. And this burns nothing for calories.
Yeah.
Even moving from sitting to standing burns about an extra, it's like a calorie a minute, which seems like nothing, but that's 60 calories an hour. If you work at a desk and do that for 8 hours a day, that's 480 calories. That's an hour of hard exercise. If you do a walking treadmill, you might go to 3 calories a minute. You could potentially burn 1,000 calories a day without even noticing because it's not exercise. It doesn't feel like exercise. So NEAT is really, there's some genetic differences. There's huge environmental factors. And it's a place where really a lot of the obesity research is focusing because it can be so profound. I actually want to go back up one more thing on environmental factors and we'll move on. Resting metabolic rate can be impacted, probably maybe NEAT, by temperature. And one of the factors that's been thrown out as part of the obesity problem, and realize that there's thousands of them, is the fact that in the Western world, we tend to stay in what they call the thermoneutral temperature zone, which I had to write it down. It's between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius or 77 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's somewhere between cool and it's a comfortable temperature, right? Most people don't like being cold. I guess if you live in very cold climates, and even then humans bundle up, right? We wear clothes, we have central heat and air. We tend to select a temperature where it's not cold enough to get shivering, which burns a lot of calories, activates brown fat adipose tissue. Even very hot temperatures can increase, and that's mainly through resting metabolic rate. So it's possible that if you acclimate to the cold by gradually wearing less clothing or turning your AC down, that can burn some extra calories. Cold also stimulates hunger, so it might be a wash. But there's another environmental factor that's relating to resting metabolic rate. And even there, I bet there's genetic differences. I'm Middle Eastern. I hate the cold, right? We are a desert people. That's my ethnic group. Evolved in the desert. I can handle the heat like nothing. Cold I hate. Other groups that more evolved in the cold can probably handle. So there's another environmental factor that is not usually considered, but I don't know how modifiable it is because people hate being cold.
Yeah.
And being miserably hot is no fun. But anyway, so that kind of, like I said, the genetic stuff is going to get way more important. I've even seen some work that genetics interact with things like other weird behavioral stuff. There's a researcher named DeCastro who's looked at real world effects, right? One of the most interesting is if you go to a party, the more people at that party, the more people in a social group, the more food people tend to eat. And I don't know why that is, other than most big parties have a lot of food. Maybe it's a social evolutionary thing, but regardless, he's shown that genetically, some people are more likely to eat more in that environment than others. So we're finding that there are just these staggering interactions. And I think that's going to be an area. There's even been some mild work that testing genetics up front and personalizing the diet may result in better weight and fat loss. And I think that's probably going to be one of the big futures of this field, the whole nutrigenomics thing, where, they're doing the same thing. They're trying to do the same thing with training now. Get a quick genetic test. You're a sprinter, you're a strength athlete, you're an endurance athlete. I don't think we're there yet. I think within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a pretty good feel for testing certain genetic markers and then knowing how to modify the diet for health or fat loss or whatever. So,
excellent. Just a thing about in regards to what you talked about temperature. I actually wrote an article on that, and like you said, the effect it actually has is so minimal because we people just adjust the clothing or the environment so it wouldn't really have a big impact. And then I'm Middle Eastern myself. I spent like 20. I've been living in Norway for 28 years, and we usually have brutal winters.
Yeah.
Like 30, sometimes minus 40 in the north of Norway. 40.
It's awful.
Yeah, it's awful.
It's awful.
And
yeah, I can't stand it any more than you can. It's horrible. So,
exactly.
It's an interesting idea, and I know some people have tried to bring out like cold vests and ice packs, and they're making some claims that are just simply out in left field about the calorie burn.
Yeah.
There's still, I haven't seen any really good quantifications of how much activating the whole brown adipose tissue pathway, how much it's really going to have an impact. And I think realistically, the 6 to 8 hours of cold exposure you'd need, I don't think it's going to be realistically doable. It's fascinating stuff, but I don't think anyone's going to be able, or the majority will be able to do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just another follow-up question when it comes to things that you do early in life. Like, for example, if you're a kid that's overweight, you'll probably have a bigger risk of being overweight when you're older. And some people say that you only get more fat cells during puberty, and you can't get more fat cells later in life. Is that true, or can you actually get more fat cells later in life?
The short answer is no. That's one of those old ideas that fat cell number is fixed, that puberty pretty much is it. We know now that once you hit a certain point, once fat cells get to a certain size, they release chemicals that recruit what are called pre-adipocytes, or baby fat cells, that can then grow and store more And we're talking extreme obesity here. Actually not even that extreme. I do think like pregnancy seems to be a time where it can occur. I actually have a really depressing paper for the women's book. They took men and women that were, they were overweight. The women were like 27% body fat, which is not fat, but it's not lean, and overfed the men and the women. They both gained both upper and lower body fat, but the lower body fat was actually made through making more cells. Yeah. The upper body fat, the fat cells just got bigger. So there's definitely some, and unfortunately, once you've got those fat cells, short of surgery or some of the new methods like cryolipolysis they've come up with, once those fat cells are there, they don't go away. So there is definitely that old idea is not true. There's also a thing, people that have more but smaller fat cells have a harder time losing weight. Smaller fat cells don't release fatty acids as easily. And you can find stuff back in the 70s that talked about hyperplastic, which is more fat cells, versus hypertrophic, bigger fat cells, obesity. And hyperplastic is and of course, women tend to have more smaller fat cells in their thighs. No surprise. So there's an odd little gender difference. But yeah, you can definitely make more fat cells if you have to get fat beyond a certain point. But absolutely you can, depressingly.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. You often hear the terms fat set points and fat settling points, and it seems that people get these terms mixed up a bit. So, could you explain what the difference is between them?
Yeah, so we know sort of generally that body weight or body fat is regulated. And all that means is that people lose weight, they will tend to come back to where they were. Frequently, if they gain weight, at least some will come back to where they were. And for decades, there's been this argument between, is it a set point or a settling point? And what that means, the settling point is environmental, right? If I take someone who's overweight and suddenly I get them doing an hour of exercise a day and change their diet, they will lose some amount of weight and they will come back into balance, and presumably they will stay there if the environment doesn't change. That's a settling point. You settle at the new body weight based on the environment. The idea of a set point has to do with that there's some sort of internal regulator, right? And the example I always use, because most people are familiar with it, is an air conditioner. And another one would be like the cruise control on a car, right? So your air conditioner you set to whatever, 30 degrees Celsius or 28. Sorry, I'm American, I think in Fahrenheit. Yeah. right? If the temperature goes up beyond a certain point, the air conditioning comes on and it comes back down. Goes below a certain point, the heat comes on and it comes back up. So you're regulating the system, but it's only environmental in as much as the temperature outside is changing. So there's always been this idea that the body, and a lot of it came out of animal work. If you overfeed an animal, its metabolic rate goes up and it tends to be more active. And if you're not force feeding it, it'll come right. But same thing on the way down. If you diet an animal down, its energy expenditure goes down, metabolism goes down, its activity goes down, so that when food is available, that's the set point. It's kind of a biological construct where you're not just seeing changes to environment, but the body is adjusting metabolic rate, activity level. There are changes in hunger. Like I said, for decades, there's been this argument going back and forth about which is occurring, and the answer is both. Like, the best models include both, and I think it's Speakman has done the papers on this. And within a certain range, it's mostly settling point, right? We know that most people can lose about 10% of their starting weight and keep it off pretty easily. But beyond that, most people's bodies, they invariably kind of springboard back. And the model he's proposed, which I think is that within a narrow range, it is a settling point. It's based on your activity and your food intake. But clearly, once you get outside that point, and this has been measured endlessly in humans, we know that resting metabolic rate goes down. Like I said, thermic effect of food, it's mainly because you're eating less. We know that since you're lighter, you burn less calories during exercise. But there's also a change in muscular efficiency. Not only are you burning less calories because you're lighter, but your muscles actually are burning less calories per pound because they become more efficient. NEAT tends to go down, hunger goes up. They've even shown that attention to tasty foods goes up, right? Thyroid hormones drop, cortisol goes up, which we'll talk about, nervous system output. Like, there's hormonal changes that are occurring, and it is clearly regulated by the brain, like, and leptin that we'll talk about, is if you replace nothing but leptin, raise it back to pre-diet levels, all those adaptations reverse, right? So I think the argument about one or the other is missing the point. It's clearly both. So within that range, it's settling point, environment, and activity and diet predominantly. Outside of that range, and like a researcher named Lyle has done some really controlled studies. He'll take people to 10 or 20% from their starting weight, and he can measure directly how much resting metabolic rate drops in response to this, how much muscular efficiency drops. And it does work both ways. If you overfeed people by 10%, resting metabolic rate goes up a little bit, TEF goes up, you burn more calories during exercise, all these changes occur that ideally would bring you back down. And there's always been a question, why is it easier to gain weight than to lose weight, right? If the system is adapting in both directions, and I think the difference, that is environmental, right? We live in an environment in the Western world, there's always tasty, delicious, inexpensive food available, especially in the States. That makes dieting very hard, right? When your body is making you hungry and craving foods and noticing that there's cake there, it's very hard to control your food intake. When your body is telling you not to eat anymore and someone gives you a donut, you eat the donut. So I think the environment, and that gets into a whole different thing with the homeostatic regulation and the hedonic, and we're not going to have time for that. But I think basically the environment can overwhelm the overeating effect very easily, but it also overwhelms the dieting effect, and it all tends to push us this way. So it's anybody, and there's some people that, like, when you've tried to gain body weight or muscle mass, right? You just get to that point where you're sick of eating. You truly are. You're just like, I don't want to eat again. I've been eating 4 to 6 meals a day, and I'm just full. For some people, I think that system does work a little bit more effectively, but clearly people can continue, you can keep force feeding it in. When you're dieting, it is a daily struggle against all of the foods that are, I think that's why a lot of lean dieters become social pariahs. If you just never leave the house, you're not exposed to it. I think if you look at a lot of the pathological habits of, like, bodybuilders and physique competitors, right? They don't go to parties, they don't go out, because if they're exposed to that kind of food, good luck sticking with your diet. Not healthy psychologically, but it's about the only way to succeed. So that's kind of that difference. Settling point environmental, set point biological, probably, and they're certainly interacting, but they're both active depending on the extremes.
Excellent.
Or the total weight loss.
But when it comes to like these adaptations that occur when you're in fat loss phase, does it occur both when you're in the settling point as well, if you're reaching the set point, or how is it?
It's hard to tell because a lot of the research tends to look at very distinct time points, right? Mm-hmm. When Lyle did his studies, he was like, spend however many weeks, let's get him to 10% over or under, and then let's take our measurements again. Yeah. And unfortunately, it would be lovely to see these data points where they're measuring sort of discreetly, but that just gets financially and technically very difficult. I suspect that there are some changes occurring early on. There's actually a paper, the same researcher just did a paper very recently looking at the resting metabolic rate changes, right? That resting metabolic, the RMR, and then what they could just call non-resting energy expenditure, which is the other three. And when he showed that there's an early change in resting energy expenditure, and then the later changes in non-rest. So basically, metabolic rate will go down fairly quickly. And then beyond that, it's things like exercise. But again, he only looked after 10% weight loss. So I think it's hard to say what the primary effect is in those early stages. I suspect there are some small changes within that 10% settling range, but clearly people can and readily do lose that amount and keep it off. So I think they're not, as long as the behaviors are maintained, as long as they keep up the activity, keep their diet change. Beyond that is clearly when the body starts fighting back harder. I think there's also a big difference in that starting body fat percentage, right? Someone who's 50% body fat their body's not fighting back that hard early on. Someone who's starting at 12%, a male, and trying to get single digits, he's already starting at a level that's fairly lean for him. So it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer. I suspect there's small differences, but it's mostly a settling point thing, just based on the real world.
Okay, excellent. So when sometimes you get these scenarios where people are doing like really high activities, they're working out several times a week, they're doing cardio, and they're eating a lot less like they're really eating really low calories, and nothing is happening. Like there's no progression. What can be some of the explanation why some people experience this?
I think there's a few of them. I think in a lot of cases, the simplest answer is they're not eating as little as they think.
Yeah.
This is just an issue, and I'm not saying that they're deliberately or consciously lying about it. They're just simply, people are bad at this. People are really bad at estimating calories. You hear this among usually smaller female dieters, right? They're being meticulous. They're measuring that tablespoon of peanut butter, but then they're packing it a little bit bigger. They're licking the spoon, that little nibble here, that little nibble there, and that's 500, and suddenly their deficit is completely eliminated. Because I think in larger men, you just don't see this, right? They've got such a bigger 20% off of a larger man's total energy expenditure might be 800 calories. They can mess up a few hundred, and it's good. A small female, or smaller males, they are on a 400 calorie a day deficit. If they screw it up by a couple hundred, their deficit is gone, right? They've gone from a predicted nearly a pound a week to less than a half. So I think that's a big part of it. You frequently see, because invariably when you hear those people say that and they go and start really measuring, they're like, oh, I was eating double what I thought. So I think that's frequently the simplest answer, but I don't think that's, there are people that I do trust that they're eating what they say they're eating and that they're exercising. I think there's also people don't report the binges. Frequently when people try to cut calories too hard, they wake up in the middle of the night. You're not hearing about the weekend blizzard binge frequently. So I think that's another, and there's actually one theoretical model of weight loss plateaus that basically said it just comes down to breaking, non-adherence. But let's assume that someone is truly tracking their calories. Let's assume that someone is truly everything is actually accurate. You do still see these weird plateaus and stalls. And I think there's a handful of reasons. One is that, right, metabolic rate does decrease, right? So let's say here's your starting energy expenditure, and you set your 500 calorie a day deficit, right? So this is 2,000, and now you're getting net 1,500 calories. And by net, I mean, I'm not going to, whether you cut calories or increase activity, there are differences, but I don't want to get into that. So let's just assume that here's your deficit. As you lose weight, as the body adapts, your energy expenditure goes down, right? It closes that deficit. And eventually you come back into balance, right? This is one of the screwiest interpretations of the 3,500 calorie rule and calories in, calories out. People ignore the changes that are occurring. And they're like, well, if you're on 500 calories a day deficit and you're not losing a pound a week, calories in, calories out doesn't work, is wrong. No, it's not. You don't understand it. Yeah. If that were true, if that never went away and you reduced calories by 500, you would lose weight until you died. That doesn't happen. It's the same reason the whole, if you eat one apple less, you'll lose X number of pounds. It's assuming that none of these numbers are changing. If you cut your calories by 100, well, by the time you lose about 5 to 7 pounds, about 3 kilos, you're burning 100 calories less. That's it. That's all you're going to lose. You have to create another 100 calorie deficit. So you see a lot of really dumb interpretations. So I think part of it is that as that happens, what was a 500 calorie deficit is now a 200 calorie deficit. The changes become so small and so slow, right? You've gone from the theoretical pound a week to maybe a pound every 2.5 weeks. This interacts with the measurement problems, right? Whether you're using the scale, calipers, or whatever, those all have an error bar, right? Body weight can do this on a day-to-day basis. Water retention, food in the gut, all these other factors, a little bit more carbs and sodium. Any woman will tell you her body weight can change 7 pounds, 3 kilos from week to week, right? Women have, menstrual cycle makes this ridiculous. That's the other podcast. If you're only losing a pound every 2.5 weeks and your body weight is variable 3 pounds a day, you're never going to pick that up, right? The best way is to measure daily, take a running average, and at least see some trend lines. Even calipers, even the best body composition methods, calipers have about a 2% error, I think. James Krieger wrote a really good series on this. Go read it. Anybody who wants to really get into the details of body comp methods, read James Krieger's series. It's amazing. Like DEXA can be off by what? 5 or 10%? Either like it wasn't designed for body fat measurement. It was designed for bone density. Yeah. It works, but if you've got a 5% error margin and you're losing 1% a month, guess what? You can't track that. Calipers are 2 to 3%. No, all those methods. So I think there's a big part of it is just measurement error. The water retention thing is very real, right? So make no mistake, metabolic adaptation is part of it. And if you look at successful, like competition dieters, once they've got some experience, they're making adjustments weekly, right? They know that fat loss is going to slow. Some will wait till it stops, but they've got their diet set up every week. They'll cut out another 100 calories a day or 50 calories a day or whatever it is. They'll add another 10 minutes of aerobic activity. And what they're doing is intuitively or just from experience, adjusting their food and energy intake to keep that deficit ideally fairly similar, right? Most people wait, and then they stall and go, oh crap, drop their calories. The successful physique competitor or dieter is kind of doing this, adjusting every couple of weeks. So I think the metabolic adjustment is part of it, error measurement, but there is a water retention factor, right? And there's both physiological and psychological factors that play into this. And I talked about this in great detail in the women's podcast, but I see it in men too. Some people are just pre-stressed, right? You can see them online. They use a lot of all caps. They use a lot of exclamation points. You can see them at the keyboard just, why am I not losing weight? And you're like, okay, you need to just take a breath. They already show elevated cortisol, right? Cortisol is a stress hormone. It does a ton of things in the body, but one of them is to cause water retention, right? People that have Cushing's disease that use cortisone pills, or actually Cushing's, they retain like kilos of water, like tens of kilos of water. It's insane. You go look online. They have this enormous puffy-faced edema where they retain water. This happens during dieting, right? Back in the seminal Minnesota study, back in the 50s, where they took the men and they put them on 50% calories. Later in the study, the guys stopped losing weight, right? Their theoretical weight loss and their actual fell off. And they even reported in the early work that they showed distinct water retention around the ankles. There is this weird it's called starvation edema, and it's been known since the early part of the 20th century. Dieting raises cortisol, and more extreme diets raise cortisol more. Exercise raises cortisol, and more extreme levels of cortisol or more extreme levels of exercise raise cortisol more. So you end up with this perfect storm. The pre-stressed dieter, the pre-psychologically stressed dieter is invariably the one, need to lose weight, 2 hours of aerobics, 800 calories. Their cortisol goes through the roof. They hold water. What do? Must cut calories harder, right? These are the people that when they finally punt it and just, you know what, screw this. They spend a weekend, they take a couple days off, they eat more calories. On Monday, they're 5 pounds lighter. There's also just, and then what do? They go right back to crazy style dieting. Like, you can fight with these people till you're blue in the face. You need to do less exercise. You need to eat more. Well, how does that work? How can that? Well, look, you're not losing anything now. What do you have to lose? And you get them to do that, well, when you can get them to do that, and things work better. So I think one group has even written that it's called athletic amenorrhea. It's another term for that loss of menstrual cycle that women get, and they've pointed out that dieting is in itself that athletic amenorrhea, it is a psychogenic stressor, right? The stress of athletes of wanting to lose weight on top of the physical effects is a stress response, and chronic elevated stress, chronic elevated cortisol causes water retention. So I think that explains a lot of the at least transient stalls. There's also just this weird ass thing that happens in the body, right? Muscle gain is never linear, right? If you look at the studies, every training, every workout is adding whatever 0.5% to your muscle mass. It's trivial, but it's adding up over time. Why don't you see muscle gains weekly? Why can't you measure them? You see them every month, and it seems to be this weird truncated thing. Again, some of it's measurement, right? If I'm tape measuring a muscle group and I'm gaining 1/32 of an inch, and no, I'm not converting that to centimeters. It's that. If I'm gaining that much on a cylinder, I can't even measure that. Once I gain 0.5 inch, suddenly I get within measurement error. But there's just this weird thing with the body where it'll stall, and then like overnight you lose 3 pounds. And way back when I took exercise physiology, my professor told us research had found that fat cells, right, which mostly contain stored fatty acids, when you lose the fat, they fill up with water. And then eventually the water gets dumped. And I spent like a decade looking for anything to support this. Found one study where the obese, their abdominal fat cells filled up with water. But there's just some weird thing, right? When people get lean, their fat gets squishy. It feels different, right? If you've got an area with a lot of body fat and you squeeze it, it's just hard. It's physically hard to the touch. It's like squeezing the fat on a steak because it's the same stuff. And when they get lean, they start to get squishy, but they don't look any different, and their weight's the same, and the calipers say they're the same. And then at some point, whatever happens, the body goes, boom, drops water, and like overnight they look leaner. So I think it's a combination of all of these. I think it's possibly not adhering to the diet. I think in the case of adherence, you're seeing measurement inaccuracies that just make it immeasurable. I think add to that water retention, and there's a very individual thing there, right? Some people who diet are just chill, right? I think the best, and there's work on this you've probably seen where people forget that psychological stress is just as real as physical stress, right? Humans are the only animals that can stress themselves in disease. Dogs don't really care. As long as they get fed, they're pretty happy. Humans worry about taxes. They worry about their mortgage. They worry about things that no animal deals with. And some people they start out more stressed than others, right? I think if you look at successful athletes, especially successful, physique dieters or dieters in general, they're very they're just very chill, and a lot of that is just inbuilt. Like, you can learn it. They've even shown that, cognitive behavioral therapy, like psychological therapy, can help these folks, which shows you how psychological it is. Some women can even mentally stress themselves into loss of their menstrual cycle. Like, they just, it's purely psychological. Psychology is affecting physiology. And if you sit here and get angry, your cortisol will go up. If you're stressed 24/7 about your weight loss and the fact that you're not losing and the fact that your weight hasn't dropped from today till tomorrow, which is ridiculously unrealistic, or that it's gone up by a pound because you ate some salt last night, you're just adding to the problem.
Yeah.
So, even with the training thing, they've shown in male athletes and presumably in women too, even taking one day off a week will cause cortisol levels to return to normal. Well, these dieters don't do that. You can see people every day in every gym, 2 hours a day of hard aerobics. They're not eating anything, and the less they lose, the harder they work. And then women have, again, the menstrual cycle. Women trying to track week to week, it's impossible. For any women listening to this that don't listen to the previous podcast, you can only compare the same week of the cycle. If you try to compare the first week to the second week, well, this is when you're going to start holding water at ovulation. Those numbers, those measurements are not comparable. Third week, it goes back down. PMS week, it tends to go back up. Comparing any of those men don't have this problem. Men are the same week to week to week. They can still do it. I've been that person. When I was in my 20s, my refeeds were terrible. I was eating way too much dietary fat. The less I lost, the more cardio I did, because I've got that personality profile. And over the years, the less stressed I've gotten about my diet, about 800 calories over, the less neurotic I've gotten. Less neurotic, me. The better it's gone, because you just don't. But again, that's so inbuilt, and there's no genetic contributor. Trying to get people to understand this, it's like telling someone to go, okay, 3, 2, 1, relax, right? It doesn't really work. To tell someone who's stressed to just relax is like telling a dog to cat. It doesn't really work that way, but frequently that one thing, or taking a day off, or raising calories every once in a while, flexible dieting, not worrying about the 50 calories over your goal you went, that alone will just change the system.
Yeah.
If you can get people to do it. Good luck. So
great that you mentioned that, because I personally have had clients that deal with these issues, that they're really stressed out person, and I've just showed them some of your articles on this topic just to make them actually more aware of what's actually going on. But another thing when it comes to the psychological stress that people experience is in terms of their recovery ability, for example, where you see some studies, because that's a factor that I think a lot of people don't take into account when they're doing their programs. And there's actually one good study done on cyclists, where they made the cyclists before the time trial either watch TV for 2 hours or do a mental test, and you clearly saw that the guys that were watching TV had much better performance than the other group.
Oh, I don't believe it for a second. And I remember getting very off topic, had to do with cyclists and stage races and the tour. And the guys that do the best are the ones that can go and compete, at the highest levels, and they come off the bike and 15 minutes later they're asleep.
Yeah.
They can turn off, and that's very biological. Robert Sapolsky, who's written most of what I know about stress, some people's stress system when they get stressed out, it stays ramped up for hours. They're the ones that just won't let stuff go. 6 hours later, just like, man, I cannot believe that guy at the bank. I cannot believe that guy was standing in line. I'm just like, dude, let it go.
Yeah.
Eric Helms sent me a couple of really good papers on this, showing that collegiate strength athletes, they make worse strength gains during exams. Yeah. And this is something that simply good coaches take this into account, right? If you're dealing with collegiates, or even when you're training clients, you've got someone going through a divorce who's dealing with some super stressful thing. If you don't cut their training back, if you don't take that into account, you will blow them up. Or their body will suddenly, what's called the allostatic load will go so high. it's like all of a sudden they got sick. Well, that's because I've seen it sort of conceptualized as, imagine the human, all the stresses are pouring in, psychological, financial. What if they, if you've got a collegiate athlete, what if they just broke up with their girlfriend or boyfriend? What if their girlfriend or boyfriend is on the team? Like oh my goodness, like the stress that causes, not for them, but now the whole team is having to deal with their interpersonal nonsense. That's adding a stressor, life stress, family stress, financial stress, school stress, and then you add physical and diet stress on top of that. And it's wonderful theoretically to go, well, just don't be stressed. Well, that's not the world that we live in. I think part of the reason some elite athletes, they've got the money or the support to be able to train full time, right? They are not having to be on their feet 8 hours a day. They're not having to work. They're having to work screwy hours, drive back and forth from work to training, have to worry about can they eat enough? These are all factors that impact on your overall ability to recover. So I agree completely. And that just adds to that water retention stress effect.
Yeah, exactly. And so glad that you mentioned that, because when I see like these people that are trying to copy the training programs of elite athletes and don't actually take into consideration that athletes don't really have all the other stress factors maybe in their lives that the normal people have with jobs and stuff like that.
Well, if you look at, back in the history of it, back in like the 70s when the Soviets and the Germans came to power, right? American athletes had to be amateurs. They'd have to work 8 hours a day, live in poverty. Like Steve Prefontaine, one of the top runners, he lived in poverty most of his life because athletes didn't get paid. Well, what the Soviets and the Germans and a lot of the Eastern European countries did to get around the amateur rules was they gave them jobs. Well, you're in the military. Your job is now to train full time. And this was when training went off the rails. Suddenly they went from training once a day to 3 times a day because the athletes were they were fed, they were clothed, they were housed, they were drugged. But that's when training volumes and frequencies and intensities just went through the absolute roof. And when you don't have that level of support on it, you just simply can't handle. You can't do the same training. You just can't. Well, you can try, but you won't be able to. You can't survive it. So absolutely.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so moving on to we touched a bit about cortisol and in regards to water retention, but can we also touch a bit about how leptin, ghrelin, and cortisol affect body weight regulation?
Sure. So sort of a quick primer, right? Leptin was really the hormone that changed the game. It's 1994. Up until that point, obesity research was on why fiber was good, and it was very boring and uninteresting. Then they realized that leptin was a hormone. They identified this hormone that was released predominantly from fat cells, went to the brain, and signaled A, how much fat you had, and B, how much you were eating, right? For decades, they had theorized that this set point, right back, they knew about the set point in the 70s, and it was postulated that there was a unknown hormone that signaled the brain on body weight or body fat, but no one had any idea what it was. 1994, they finally found it, or at least the first one, and that was leptin. So when you diet, leptin goes down super quickly. It can go down within about 50% within a week. Clearly, you have not lost 50% of your body fat. Yeah. That would be awesome. Yeah. It's responding to calorie intake and especially carbohydrate intake. Then as you lose body fat, leptin drops even further. So you see this really quick drop, and then it's way more gradual. The same thing happens when you overfeed, right? If you overeat carbs for 3 days, leptin goes up, and then if you keep gaining fat, it'll go up more gradually. And this is where some of the dietary strategies like refeeds and diet breaks and stuff come from. Leptin is turning out to be released from a bunch of other places. Muscle makes a little bit, stomach makes a little bit. That's another one that I haven't really had time to keep up with. Fat is still by and far the primary, the major contributor. And the higher your body fat, the more leptin you make. The lower, the less leptin you make. The brain can become insensitive. But leptin is really it coordinates a lot of these effects in terms of body weight regulation, right? Like I said, there was a study, really, for years they wanted leptin to cause body weight loss, and it kind of didn't. And that really frustrated people because they were using it wrong, right? Leptin does not really cause weight loss, except in these leptin deficient people. What it does is it reverses the adaptations to dieting. It makes dieting work better. So they took a group of men and women, very small study, and they've repeated it. Dieted them down, and they saw metabolic rate went down. Fat loss stalled. Thyroid went down. Cortisol went, like all the hormones did what they were supposed to do. All they did was injected leptin to raise it back to pre-diet levels. All of these reversed. That one change made all of these reverse. Unfortunately, leptin just really never made it out of the clinical stage. They're using it now for these people that don't produce it. There's even a couple papers where leptin can reverse menstrual cycle loss that women experience. It's telling the brain, effectively, you're starving. When it drops, it's telling the brain you're starving to death. Your body adapts. So the leptin is really the primary hormone. Okay, ghrelin's another big one. Ghrelin is released from the stomach, and it is the only hormone they found that actually stimulates hunger, right? Those Prader-Willi people I mentioned earlier don't respond, or something with their ghrelin receptor doesn't work, or maybe they don't produce it. I don't remember, but it's ghrelin related. Ghrelin goes up when you diet, right? Since it stimulates hunger level, it's odd. Ghrelin goes up at the time of day when you normally eat. I don't have any idea how this works, but ghrelin entrains with your normal meal times, right? So if you normally eat at 1 o'clock, ghrelin goes up at like 10 minutes before, and that's why you get hungry at the times you normally eat. That's why changing meal frequency is often a hassle for a few days. If you're used to eating 6 meals a day or 4, and you change your meal frequency or meal times, I'm convinced that's how my dogs know when it's time to eat. They don't have a watch. I can't figure out any other way they can tell what time it's meal time. But they always start whining when I normally feed them. Ghrelin and leptin interact in an enormous way, and it's the decrease in leptin and the increase in ghrelin that plays a major role in stimulating the metabolic adaptations that occur. And they both change in the wrong way when you lose weight. And technically they go the other direction when you overeat, which is why, in theory, that should cause you to lose the weight again, and some people do. It's just the environment can overwhelm that. So ghrelin's a really, really important hormone. And then there's cortisol, which we talked about a little bit. Cortisol is a stress hormone, which actually, its effects on body weight and body fat are very distinct. Pulses of cortisol, right? Physiological increases that go away stimulate fat mobilization. It's mainly involved in blood glucose regulation, right? You'll hear it referred to as a glucoregulatory hormone, which just means it regulates blood glucose. So when blood sugar goes down, cortisol goes up. And pulses of cortisol are very physiologically adaptive, right? So again, Robert Sapolsky has written about this. His book is called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And his basic point is that we're supposed to work under conditions of experience the stress goes away, chill out, adapt, right? Exercise raises cortisol. If you stress the system and give it a chance to recover, you adapt. Yeah. If you stress the system constantly, the body never gets a chance to recover, and you eventually fall apart, right? This was Hans Selye's work in the early 20th century, the whole stressor adaptation, whatever the third phase was. That's why you can train hard, really hard, for 4 to 6 weeks, and then your body blows up. If you train and recover, you adapt, and that pretty much happens for most systems, right? With chronic stress being the really bad one, and we tend to live in a situation of chronic stress. It can cause stress eating, although that's very individual. Some people get it and some people don't. Some people lose their appetite when they're stressed, and others stress eat. And it has to do with kind of whether the stress is coming chronically or alternatingly, and it gets super complicated, and I don't remember the details enough to say anything intelligent about it. But cortisol affects the others. Cortisol causes leptin resistance. So when cortisol is chronically elevated, leptin can't send its normal signal to the brain. So if leptin is down because you're dieting and cortisol is up because you're chronically stressed, it's a double whammy. Leptin controls cortisol. As leptin levels go down on a diet, cortisol release increases. So all these hormones, I'm sure there's cortisol ghrelin interactions. I don't know what they are offhand, but I'm sure they exist. So basically, like I said, and that just gets back to the chronic versus acute stress thing. Chronic stress just causes the whole system to go south. That's on top of the water retention thing. There's something called disinhibition, and it has to do with restrained eating, which are people that are very tightly wound about their food intake, for lack of a better way of putting it. Under certain conditions, they will lose control of their eating, and they'll become disinhibited, right? They're the ones that break their diet a little bit and go, screw it, eating a bag of cookies. Cortisol seems to be involved in that. There's a very individual difference. That's like it's really incorrect to distinguish psychology from physiology, but that is a quote unquote psychological factor that contributes to this. But cortisol is certainly involved in the potential for disinhibition, and it's that whole stress eating thing. One theory is that stress causes neurochemical changes in the brain. Eating carbs lowers cortisol. Yeah. So one of the theories is that part of the reason cortisol stimulates stress eating is it's a self-medication thing. You're trying to jack some carbs in. And I saw somebody posted something on my group recently that I found very strange. And they were trying to give a dietary strategy to prevent stress snacking. And what they recommended was eating small amounts of carbohydrate snacks between meals. And I'm like, oh, so what you're saying is that snacking is a good way to prevent snacking? What? I'm being a little bit facetious. What they were getting at is that doing it in a controlled, healthy fashion, better to have, a pre-stress small amount of carbohydrate than ending up at the vending machine. I just found it we're going to help control stress snacking with snacking. Regardless. So that's kind of what's going on with this system. Leptin's the big player, predominantly a long-term signal. It drops on a diet, the whole system. Like when they inject just leptin alone, all of this stuff reverses. The attention to food, the increased hunger, the energy expenditure hormones, like that one thing. Unfortunately, it's about $500 a day right now. And you'd have to do 2 shots a day. So fantastic, never got out of the clinical realm. Ghrelin, they'll probably come up with ghrelin antagonists that will help to control hunger on a diet. There's some evidence that the obese and lean people may respond differently to ghrelin. And then there's the whole cortisol thing, which impacts water retention, how the hormones work in the brain, stress eating, blood sugar, and all of these interact. And there's a zillion other signals. CCK, peptide YY, they're finding new ones almost weekly. Like, I've given up. I was really big into this in the 90s and 2000s. And at this point, I can't keep track of it anymore. They find a new hormone every day that seems to be, and they all interact. So they all tend to do the same thing. Undereat and everything goes wrong. Overeat and everything gets better. And that's a big part of the adaptations, which I think is your next question.
Yeah, excellent. Just a follow-up question. You said that carbohydrates affects cortisol, and you also mentioned that carbohydrates affects leptin levels. Do any of the other macronutrients have any effects on these hormones?
To a limited degree. Cortisol mainly is a blood glucose thing, so carbs tend to have the biggest impact. Leptin, the carbohydrate effect is short-term, like in 2 to 3 days, because again, that short-term response is very rapid. It's really responding to nutrient availability, and there's this biochemical pathway. If you get bored, look up the hexosamine biosynthetic pathway, and that's what's going on. And then the longer term, it's really the changes in body fat. Protein and fat may have a small effect, and this gets more into the ghrelin and the stomach stuff. Like, protein impacts more on cholecystokinin, well, protein, fat, and fiber, cholecystokinin, and I think peptide YY. Like, different nutrients do impact. Leptin, short-term predominantly carbohydrate thing. Cortisol, if protein and fat are having an effect, I'm not aware of it. But ghrelin is more of a general appetite, food intake type of thing. But yeah, like, especially for that, like, short-term overfeeding, if you're gonna calorie load on a diet to try to raise leptin or impact on this, carbohydrates really tend to have the major impact. Also important, only carbs can refill muscle glycogen, right? Another issue that the trainees get into is that muscle glycogen gets depleted. They can't do high-intensity training. So carbs kind of, in my mind, have really I see people going, well, I raised fat to 80% for a day. A, one-day refeed, probably not going to do much. And 2, doing it as dietary fat is going to do less than nothing. I saw someone say, "Yeah, I do it as a thyroid reset." What? Thyroid hormones, for example, respond only to carbohydrate intake. So a lot of this, and even the menstrual cycle stuff, there's some thought that it's as much energy availability as it is carbohydrate availability. The brain is responding to blood sugar levels. So even Ann Lukes, who did that work, seemed to, some of it indicated that it was as much carbohydrate availability. So carbs really do seem to be having, especially in the short term, the primary effect. The dietary fat is probably longer. Protein's not really an energy substrate so much. It's really more for tissue rebuilding, so I wouldn't expect it to have a major effect.
Excellent. Okay, let's round it up with the last question. Regarding metabolic adaptations, it seems like different people react differently to deficits, and some people adapt more than others. So, what are strategies that people can use during a calorie deficit phase that will not completely reverse the adaptation, but limit them to some extent?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, even all this work that looks at all these changes, like, there can be a fivefold difference. Like, there are some people that are clearly more diet resistant than others. Like, they've even identified like 2 women in one study. They put them on a 500 calorie per day deficit. Their energy expenditure dropped by 500. Like, literally, it counteracted the entire deficit almost immediately. Even in the Minnesota study, the change in resting metabolic rate varied from like 100 to 500 calories a day, and other papers have seen that. I mentioned the NEAT study. There was a 7-fold difference in how much NEAT increased with overfeeding. Like, it's just drastic, and this does absolutely explain why some people have an easier time than others. And I think just like successful athletes have genetic advantages they may not even be aware of that allow them to adapt or start at a higher level, successful dieters have an easier time of it. And I know we want to just chalk it up to willpower and work ethic, but it's just not even debatable. Again, Eric Helms, a buddy of mine, he had a competitor, male competitor, that was tracking a lot of data on his diet, and he found that his number of steps per day, right, and that's a measure of that NEAT, dropped from like 15,000 to 3,000 during his diet. Like, that is staggering, right? Some people maintain their activity during diet. Some other people, all they want to do is lay around all day. I actually, going back to the question about high activity and low calories, I think another part of it is people that do that are exhausted all the time. Right? In their brain, they're going, I'm burning 500 calories a day in exercise. Right. And you're moving around 500 calories per day less later in the day because you're exhausted constantly. And guess what? That offset that change that you made. And hard dieting just leaves you too tired to move around. There's a weirdness they've seen in women in anorexia. There's frequently a hyperactivity. People that animals and even some anorexics that are starving to death move around more. And I think the theory is that, well, the more you move around, the more likely you are to find something to eat. Yeah. But there's just this weird, and unfortunately, nobody seems to really know what's causing this. Like, I suspect it's differences in how much thyroid drops, how much nervous system drops, leptin sensitivity, thyroid sensitivity, all of this other stuff, I've talked about strategies for years, refeeds, diet breaks that are sort of hoping to, reset some of these systems. You can never reverse it completely. That's the first take home. Without drugs, you can never reverse it completely. Drugs fix the problems. There's a reason bodybuilders do what they do. They take thyroid meds. They take ephedrine or Clen. They take cortisol blockers. A drug-using bodybuilder at 4% might have a very normal-looking physiology. A male natural bodybuilder at 4% has castrate testosterone levels, cortisol off the map, thyroid in the garbage bin. Like, it is a distinct. So drugs work best, quite honestly. I'm not recommending that. It is a statement of fact. Honestly, the biggest, short of using like thermogenic compounds, ephedrine, green tea, cayenne pepper, even nicotine patches and gums people have used. They boost metabolism by 5%, which helps to offset some of this. Honestly, probably NEAT is the biggest potential, I think. I mean, yeah, you can keep increasing activity, but it's still just you're kind of chasing your tail. If you're one of those people that is getting a bigger drop in metabolic rate, and here's the thing, even there, most of the change in energy expenditure is not resting metabolic rate. This is one of those, the whole metabolic damage thing is it's not resting metabolic rate that's affected. Most of the impact is through the non-resting change. In the obese, the adaptation of metabolic rate is like 5 to 10%. 90% of it is in activity. Even in the Minnesota cohort, the resting metabolic rate drop was larger. It was like 15%, or was it 25%? But that still leaves the majority of it being in activity. The men were exhausted all the time. And they were doing 2 hours of forced walking a day. And it was mostly non-resting energy expenditure, which means that that's really the place where we can have a potential impact. Gradually increasing amounts of exercise will help to offset that, right? Even in that stupid Biggest Loser study that just came out, which they've now done an erratum to, showing that their numbers were about double what their initial calculations were, about double what the numbers really were. That just got released. Even though there was this supposed big drop in resting metabolic rate, their total daily energy expenditure was still higher because they were doing 8 hours of exercise per day. And again, I'm not recommending this, but it makes the point that if the big drop is in the non-resting energy expenditure components, if it's in activity and NEAT, that's really where I think the potential lies. Now, part of it is that NEAT is subconscious or unconscious, whichever one of those words is correct. But part of it is very environmental, right? I think a lot of these new activity trackers, I think, accurate or not, even the step counters, I'm finding that people who are using those, when you're able to really see the changes that are occurring, it allows you to adjust is the wrong word, but it at least gives you the awareness that, oh my God, I'm walking 5,000 steps less a day than I was. That's a place that you can consciously, actively make an effort to adapt to that, right? You're not, like I said, short of drugs or refeeds, you're not affecting rest about TEF will always be down because you're eating less.
Yeah.
You can't eat more, really. Activity, you can do more. You can't really change the efficiency thing. They actually, I wrote about this years ago, and Lyle even looked at it. Right, part of the drop in energy expenditure is just being lighter. Lighter body burns less calories, but there's also this other adaptation. And what he actually did was he put a weight vest on the people. He replaced the diet loss to see if that would reverse. And it did. It reversed about half of it. It reversed the weight loss component of it. And I wrote about that, I think, in Rapid Fat Loss damn near a decade ago. But it's only going to offset part of that. And you got to be wary of joint problems. But gradually increasing activity in the gym, but really NEAT, I think, is the key player. You can burn so many calories without it being formal exercise. The trackers will let you track that. And I find a lot of people, I think the biggest advantage of those is that when you see the numbers, people turn it into a game. They're like, well, I want to beat yesterday's number. So I think that's really an environmental behavioral thing. There is some evidence that, again, bigger deficits might have a bigger effect on some of these metabolic rate adaptations on top of the fatigue, some of the other things. They are bigger, so it's kind of a wash, but I think one of the reasons that people, who reverse diet or whatever are like, oh, I'm losing fat on higher calories, I think it's having more of an indirect effect. If raising your calories by 200 a day keeps your NEAT from dropping by 300 a day, well, you've gained 100 calories, right? You've actually gained 100 calorie deficit by eating more, but it's not because you're not because you're stoking your resting metabolic rate. You're reversing some of the negatives that the hard extreme dieting was having. And I think that's on top of everything else going on. So I really do think that NEAT is the place people need to focus, to find a way to, if not to increase it, just to keep it from dropping. But to do that, you have to have a measure. If you're one of those people that's still just burning a ton, or have a job especially, we were talking about this in my group, and someone was like, it was the cardio thing. People were like, well, you don't need cardio to lose weight. Well, some people do. if their energy expenditure goes way down, I got bad news for you. They do need it. This idea that you don't in absolute term. And someone mentioned, he's like, yeah, I got a client who works, he's a Budweiser delivery guy. He does 30,000 steps a day. Yeah, he doesn't need cardio. Mm-hmm. Another one of his clients, office worker, 3,000 steps a day. Guess who needs cardio? Yeah. Like that idea, that's such an individual thing. And then there's just the individual changes. So I really do think that's those activity trackers and really looking at keeping meat from falling or even trying to increase it gradually. Like I really do think that that's probably not only the future of a lot of obesity treatment, but the future of keeping diets working. Yeah, because it's a limit. You can only add so much formal exercise, right? You can only do so much in the gym. But even there, you hear people like, oh, you should never have to do 2 hours of cardio a day. Guess what? If you're a 120-pound female trying to eat 1,200 calories and not starve to death, you don't have many options. Yeah. If you're a 180-pound male, yeah, probably not. You got more food, and I think a lot of people lose sight of those types of things. Meat's just easier. It doesn't feel like formal. It's not, I got to go to the gym and grind for an hour. It adds up in such significant amounts for such small, it doesn't feel like exercise. Walking at 2.5 miles an hour on a walking desk, you don't even know you're doing it. Like, it doesn't feel like formal exercise. Going to the gym to sit on the treadmill for an hour is just depressing and miserable.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think these activity watches get a lot of critique because they're not accurate. But I'm like, if they make people aware how inactive they are. For example, you're sitting, like, let's say your goal is to walk 10,000 steps a day, and you've been sitting at the office all day and you've done 3,000 steps. You might take a walk that evening just to fill up your steps. So I think a lot of people make better decisions during the day just Absolutely. To get the steps in.
Yeah, just because they're aware. And even if they're not accurate, as long as they're consistent is really, to me, in so many things. Nothing is going to be perfectly accurate. But as long as they're close enough and are consistent for a given individual, and even there, just a basic step tracker, all it's picking up is your footfalls. Yeah. That alone will go such an enormous way. I've got someone I'm helping now. They can't understand why, they're doing like 20,000 steps a day. And I'm like, this is why you can't adapt to your training. It's why your squats aren't going up. You're on your feet all day and you need to eat more because they don't realize just how many calories 20,000 steps a day is going to burn. So we're definitely, I agree with you completely.
Yeah. Excellent. One last question in regards to refeeds. Could you please just explain in regards to doing only 1 day of refeeds a week compared to doing more days a week?
Yes. So way back in the day, when I first sort of conceptualized refeeds, and make no mistake, I was not the first one. I think I just kind of formalized it. Yeah. The idea is that by pumping in calories and carbs, you raise leptin, right? That is inarguable, right? Even 5 hours of refeeding will raise leptin. But the question was always, is this enough to, tell the brain, for lack of a better word, that you're no longer starving to death? And my feeling now is that no, that those shorter refeeds probably aren't. Although this is very contextual. And the reason is that we know that when you start dieting, right, it takes about 3 or 4 days for the brain to really sense that anything has changed. I mean, leptin drops within 24 hours, no doubt, but you don't see an increase in appetite for about 4 days. Even humans are very different than little critters. For a human, a meal doesn't mean anything. A day doesn't mean anything. This idea that missing a meal puts you in starvation mode is nonsense. 4 days of total starvation, energy expenditure goes up by about 5%. Like, it does not the whole thing. In an animal who lives 2 years, a meal is a big deal. There's a little animal, is it a prairie vole? They miss a meal, they will die because they're 30 grams and they have no body fat. Humans have tons of stored energy. So we know absolutely that there's a delay when you start dieting. And my sense is that it works in the opposite direction, right? So think of it again from what your brain is sensing, or in evolutionary terms. Boom, day where you don't eat. It is what it is. 2 days, By the 4th day, probably food supply is down. Time to start adapting. Well, in the same token, if you overeat for a day, how does your body, maybe you just found whatever. You found something to eat. That doesn't mean it should automatically reverse that. And in this vein, I've got some studies on women in menstrual cycle that their hormone levels, like 5 days of very low calories followed by 1 day of enormous refeeding doesn't change anything. But 3 days followed by 2 days of refeeding reverses it. And there's an interesting study in military guys where just what they call a multi-stress environment, very little sleep. It's like Navy SEALs, very few calories, everything just goes this way. 1 week of refeeding reverses everything, right? That's the full diet. So somewhere between those two is where refeed. And my gut says that on average, 2 days are probably the minimum, but a lot of this depends on frequency. This is something Eric Helms and I have been discussing, right? I'm sure you've done a podcast on like the alternate day fasting, intermittent caloric restriction type of idea. And the idea is that rather than dieting relentlessly every day, in the obese people, they typically put them on low calories 1 day and eat normally the next day, and low calories and eat normally rather than, and what you find is that over the week, the net deficit is about the same. Still about 30%, but it's psychologically maybe easier from an adherence, but physiologically it may work better. They don't seem to lose as much lean body mass. Could be a measurement error because they use bioelectrical impedance. But there's something, and I think with athletes especially, right? If you're trying to train intensely Monday, Wednesday, Friday, a hard deficit every day, but if you do normal calories, low that every other day refeeding, Eric is of the opinion, and I think I agree with him, like, let's say you diet 5 days. Your body goes, boom, dieting, leptin falls, lower hormones. 1 day of refeeding probably doesn't get it done. 2 days of refeeding probably does get it done. But what if you only diet for 2 or 3 days and then put in a refeed before the brain senses it? Like however you want to conceptualize it. 1 day of refeeding, even just going to maintenance, may be effective done more frequently. So 2 days of hard dieting, 1 day of refeeding, or 3 and 1, or whatever, will depend on body fat percentage. One of the things people never could quite wrap their heads around is that the leaner you get, the more frequently you need to break your diet. People think of it in the leaner you get, the harder you got to go. Nope, actually it's the other way around. And I would also say people that are more diet resistant, I think probably doing refeeds more frequently is another approach that they should consider. If their body's fighting back sooner and harder, they almost need to diet less strictly. I think a lot of the people you see that get away with women on 1,000 calories and 2 hours aerobics, and they never stall and they never have problems, they've got one of those systems that's very robust, that's very sensitive to it, that doesn't adjust as hard, and they don't have to worry about it. And most people don't. So I think that. So I think whether the 1 or 2 day or even 3 day refeed, I think it depends on frequency, body fat percentage. My ultimate diet too was about 2.5 days, 2 to 3 days every week, 4 days of hard dieting, and that worked really well for people. I think a 1 day refeed every 2 or 3 days might work. And Eric's been experimenting with this, and he's found with his competitors that using that intermittent caloric restriction approach, they recover better, they don't overtrain, their performance is better, they lose less lean body mass. He's finding that the women aren't losing their menstrual cycle as rapidly, which I think is critical. I think honestly that type of approach, regardless of how it's done, and I can't find, I've been looking for years. There is a study I have that uses that every other day thing, kind of like Martin Birkin's lean gains, that uses it did high calorie, low calorie, high, and I swear that leptin dropped more slowly or some adaptation. And I have not been able to find that paper for a decade. So either I hallucinated it or I just cannot figure out the search terms. But I do remember seeing something roughly, and I do think especially for athletes, I do think for everybody, I do think that ICR, this intermittent caloric restriction, is probably going to help both with adherence, but also to get around some of these adaptations, just because you're breaking the system's sensing of the signal. I even want to look at it a little bit more frequently. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Okay, Lyle, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
That was awesome. Where can people find more information about you?
My website, you can get to it by lylemcdonald.com or body recomposition, all one word, .com. I have a very active Facebook group. That's probably where I spend most of my time these days. I do have a vBulletin forum at forums.lylemcdonald.com, but honestly, forums are kind of dying. I think Facebook is real. So find my Facebook group. It's called Body Recomposition. Check out my website. The women's book hopefully will be done. It's actually been divided into 2 parts since we last talked. Nutrition and fat loss is coming first, hopefully end of the year. Training is coming second because the 450-page book was just going to be dumb. So that should be done this year. But said the Facebook group, the website's just, that's where I put new articles and stuff up in my books.
Great. I think a lot of people are really looking forward to your new book. And for people that haven't been to Lyle's website, I highly recommend his books. I've learned a lot from reading his stuff, and I think that a lot of practitioners that work in the industry with clients use a lot of the recommendations that you've actually written.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I've certainly been told by some of the up and comers because we've got some really smart folks coming up in the industry. I'm finding like folks that are taking both a very academic and practical approach. Eric Helms, Brett Contreras, Brad Schoenfeld, seeing a lot of really interesting research. And I've had several of them tell me that it's like, yeah, because I read their papers and I'm just like, that looks really familiar. He was like, yeah, I kind of got that from your first book, and which is good. Like I'm glad whatever I've done to sort of move the industry towards more evidence-based. I certainly hope that I've contributed something other than just being a jerk to people. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way, that you've contributed a lot. So I wouldn't worry about that. So
yeah, I got better. So
yeah, excellent. Okay, Lyle, thank you so much, and have a great day.
Very good. Thank you.